Diannely Antigua is a Dominican American poet and educator born and raised in Massachusetts. Her debut collection, Ugly Music, was the winner of the Pamet River Prize and a 2020 Writing Award. Her second poetry collection, Good Monster, was just released this month from Copper Canyon Press. Diannely received her BA in English from the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where she won the Jack Kerouac Creative Writing Scholarship, and received her MFA at NYU, where she was awarded a Global Research Initiative Fellowship to Florence, Italy. In 2022, Diannely was proclaimed the 13th Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the youngest and first person of color to receive the title. She currently teaches in the MFA Writing Program at the University of New Hampshire as the inaugural Nossrat Yassini Poet in Residence, and she hosts the podcast Bread and Poetry, which seeks to make poetry accessible to all in a way that nourishes the soul. I have had the distinct pleasure of hearing Diannely read twice. She was one of the featured poets in Open Mouth's third annual festival in 2019, and then I heard her read again in 2023 at the Arkansas International and Massachusetts Review offsite party at AWP in Seattle. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm a little tired today.
Thank you for
Yeah.
being flexible with time. I know you have a lot going on, so.
Yeah, it's no problem. Actually, it worked better for me. Actually, I was also running some errands. I'm headed to New York tomorrow, so I was just like doing some last minute stuff.
Oh, wow. Hey, well,
Yeah.
we can start there. Tell me what you've been up to.
Well, so my book just launched on Tuesday, which was May 14th, and had a book launch party at a local bar in town in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was amazing. I had some of my close like poet friends out here read, and I had a local DJ some music and spin some tunes. And it was a really, really good turnout. And I sold a lot of books as well. So it was just like a magical evening. Yeah, I wore like a 90s inspired outfit. The DJ played mainly like boy bands. It was great. I loved it so much.
That sounds like so much fun.
Yeah.
How does that compare to your debut's release?
I feel like my debut release, like because it was my first book, I felt like I was more like all business. I felt like, oh, this has to be serious. This is a serious launch. And I didn't really think of it as a party, or the possibility of it being a party. I had Jess Riscala open for me that day, which was awesome. I mean, she's amazing. We went to NYU together and then I read, but it was a much smaller group, more intimate, and it was at the restaurant that I worked at the time in 2019, which was really lovely to be, supported by my community. Um, but it definitely didn't feel so much like a party as this one did. This felt like just a celebration in a way that the first one didn't feel as much. Like this felt like a birthday party, like a real birthday party. You know what I mean?
Can you tell me more about your grad school experience?
Sure. So, I could start anywhere. I don't even know what you want to know, but I'll tell you. I So I went to NYU, their creative writing program, and first of all, like the location was amazing. It was like right in the village, and you have classes in the Lillian Vernon Writers House, and it's this like really cute little place that was donated by this woman, Lillian Vernon, and it's just an awesome location in the city, and it feels like a home. And I liked that type of environment as a way to make the students feel comfortable. I think writing, especially poetry, is a very vulnerable, intimate experience. And being in an environment that felt very much like a home while learning poetry was something that I loved. And it just served as like a refuge. Like anytime I was kind of wandering the city, I knew that I could always just stop at the writer's house and hang out there for a little bit and like read on the couch or, you know, have some coffee, and that was really lovely. And I think overall, my grad school experience was really just eye-opening in a lot of ways. Not necessarily just when it comes to poetry, but just when it came to life in general. Considering the way that I was raised very strict religious, kind of Pentecostal of sorts, though it was non-denominational. And I was sheltered in a lot of ways, so much so that I didn't even listen to secular music or anything. And that was about 10 years of my life from 9 to 19. So when I went to grad school, I was 26, had just turned 26, and I was really dealing with a lot of the residue of that experience. And coming into my own and being in New York itself was kind of a crash course into life. Sometimes in a great way, sometimes in a not so great way. But I really needed that. I needed to grow up where my family wasn't watching me do that. And New York was a great place to kind of escape to and get that necessary self work done. And then also write some poems too. And in the midst of it all, I studied with some amazing, you know, poets, Sharon Olds, Yusuf Komunyakaa, Catherine Barnett, Megan O'Rourke, Matthew Rohr. I mean, I couldn't have asked for like a better core faculty, and also learned from Deborah Landau as well, who's a director. It was just like I didn't even because I was such a baby poet and also just like a baby in life, I didn't even know that I was learning from these giants, you know. Um, and once I finally realized, you know, who I was learning from, I was like, fuck, how the hell did I get into this program? So it was like really surreal, for sure.
That was going to be my question, actually. How did you end up there if you hadn't had any experience before then?
I mean, I did have some experience when it came to poetry. I mean, I studied creative writing in undergrad, but I didn't really take a lot of poetry classes. I was actually focusing more on prose than anything else. I was taking fiction classes, and I was taking memoir writing classes as well. And I took maybe like two or three poetry courses. And they didn't really teach as many contemporary writers uh, as one would hope, except for the very, very last poetry class I took, who it was taught by Maggie Dietz, and she taught, you know, living poets, and that was so important. And that was when she asked me, and she was like, "Are you planning on getting an MFA?" And I was like, What is that? You know, what is an MFA? What does one do with that?" Um, so yeah, that's when I even first found out that it was possible for you to study poetry, you know, at at a master's level. I didn't realize that that was an option. So, considering that, you know, I in a way I came to poetry relatively late. So, it it took me going to grad school to realize um, just the abundance of poetry that was out there, the voices that I hadn't heard yet, and you know I would discover soon, and also my own voice. I don't know, I didn't think that I had more to say other than the fact that I was a woman of color that grew up bilingual. And I thought, well, that's what people want to hear about is that experience, the immigrant experience. Uh, and I didn't think there was anything else that people would want to hear from me. So it was just the whole experience was about finding voices, my own, others, and it was really life changing.
That's awesome. Since grad school, you've taken on a bunch of different roles in various places. Do you want to talk about those?
Sure. I mean, ones that are poetry related or not poetry related.
Anything you want to talk about? I'm mostly curious to hear how you've managed to maintain a writing practice outside academia.
Yeah. I mean, so right after grad school, I worked in food service. I moved back home from New York and I didn't have a job, didn't have any money, didn't have a car. And here, in this area, public transportation obviously isn't the same as New York. So where I was staying with some family and down the street was an Applebee's. And I was like, well, that's where I'm going to work. And that's how I kind of just started um, kind of creating a career out of poetry by doing something that was the opposite of it, which was serving, which allowed me time after work in order to write. And it was great also because I was using a different part of my body and my mind when I was serving. So when it came to wanting to write, I was ready with ideas. I was ready with things that I needed to say, as opposed to, some of the other jobs that I've held before then that, I was at a desk, 9 to 5, and that was really mentally draining. But that was really great for my writing practice to be on my feet for most of the day and to be talking to people and um, hearing about other people's experiences. And that was really honestly, like, I think that working in food service is a skill everyone should acquire at some point. But then I just started, doing other things. I was a substitute teacher. I, what else did I do? I trying to think what my other job was. Oh, I worked at a ballroom dance studio. I forgot about that. As an administrative assistant, and I took ballroom dance lessons. So a lot of things that were the complete opposite in a lot of ways to poetry, but I needed flexibility in my schedule in order to maintain any semblance of being an artist, and a 9 to 5 job wasn't going to give that to me. And most recently, I was Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where I reside. And it's a job that comes with, or a role that comes with a very small honorarium. But I've been able to take that platform of being Poet Laureate and kind of just create other opportunities for myself. And the majority of them are paid because I advocate for myself, which is really important being an artist, especially an artist of color, is to ask for an honorarium. And, even if there isn't one to begin with, sometimes they can find something. And that's important to do that and to know your worth. And that's just going to attract more opportunities like that. So, I've been partnering with, nonprofits and doing art events with them and visiting schools and getting paid to do that type of work, uh, delivering keynote addresses, like things that I never really imagined I would do, or that, I didn't imagine poetry would take me there. And I also didn't know that that was what I wanted to do this whole time, was to, you know, be public facing to some degree and talk about poetry, though not necessarily teach it all the time, but more so be a a preacher of sorts of the gospel of poetry. And that's been something that has just arisen from the role of being poet laureate.
Let's talk a bit more about that since you mentioned it. How does
Sure.
it feel to be the youngest and first person of color to hold that role?
Yeah. So Portsmouth, New Hampshire is a very kind of homogenous community in the sense that there isn't a lot of diversity here. So living here was difficult in that regard. I don't hear people speaking Spanish. I don't see people that look like me or have my hair. It's very, very rare. And I think it was about time that a person of color was poet laureate. And because not only to bring or for that, for someone to hold the post, someone of color to hold the post, but what that would bring with it, especially um, bringing different voices and perspectives as opposed to kind of this homogenous way of thinking, which can kind of be an issue with communities like this. So, and it's been my mission to bring more diverse voices as well. So part of my work as poet laureate was to invite more poets of color to come and read at our reading series, invite them to hold workshops, which I would pay them for, just to really, really like put my money where my mouth is, like to support other writers of color, and also, expose this community to the beauty of their work as well. And I'm hoping that with that exposure to more writers of color, that ignites a fire or a hunger in this community to continue that practice. And I'm hoping that I've paved the way for other writers of color to potentially hold this post. But it's been interesting to say the least, but at the same time, I've had a core group of people who've been supportive of just about anything that I've come up with. The podcast that I have being one of them, the Bread and Poetry podcast. So it was a challenge, but also because I was the first of something, there is a certain, kind of fame that comes with it being the first of something. But it is challenging as well because I'm setting a precedent that, for something that's never been done before. And people could be quick to judge for sure. If I made a mistake, I'm sure someone would have been like, well, that's why, we shouldn't have phones of color or whatever. I don't know. Who knows? But it was just both a blessing and a challenge to be the first person of color to hold a post, for sure.
Since you bring up Bread and Poetry, I love that podcast. I listen to it at the gym all the time. Do you want to talk about do you want to talk about how it came to be?
Sure. So part of my work as poet laureate was to create a project, and my project was the podcast. I had been wanting to have a podcast for a very long time. And I was like, well, I mean, what am I an expert at? Or what do I think I'm an expert at or hope I'm an expert at? I'm like, it's poetry. And there's this poem by poet Roque Dalton that's the title is Like You. And one of the lines of this poem says, I believe the world is beautiful and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. And that singular sentence was the driving force of my mission as poet laureate and then for the podcast. And on this podcast, we talk about poetry, but we do also talk about bread. And it's interesting how conversations about bread bring about a vulnerability. And it's interesting to see too how the stories that each of my guests bring about, maybe their favorite type of bread or a beautiful or challenging memory about bread ends up connecting to the poems we talk about. And I don't know and it's not really intentional, it's not planned, it kind of just happens organically. And it's wonderful to see that happen with each episode, how everything just connects. My most recent interview was with John Murillo, and that was just a beautiful conversation about bread and basketball. And then somehow we ended up, at, in Pompeii. Like it was just all of these different things. And I definitely encourage folks to listen to that episode because all of the places we went just connected to the bread. And really the mission of the podcast has been to make poetry accessible, and like bread, sustains life. I'm hoping that poetry will do the same.
Do you have a dream podcast guest?
A dream podcast guest. I mean, it might It might be Sharon Olds, I think, because I mean, she was my professor, and I just remember her saying, like, kind of like the wildest, but also cutest things that I have ever heard in my life, as answers to questions. And there was this one reading that I went to, and there was this, short little Q&A afterward. And someone asked her, what advice do you have for writers? And she said, take your vitamins and kiss your wrists. And I was like, that is awesome. It sounds like it has nothing to do with poetry, but it really does. Like, you have to take care of your body, and you have to also like love yourself and take care of that internal family that we all have and we carry. And if that means kissing your wrists metaphorically or literally, then that's what that means. And I try to think of that advice when I'm not really sure what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. I'm like, okay, I just got to take my vitamins and kiss my wrists.
She does seem like she'd be a really great guest.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Good Monster. I love your book titles and how they juxtapose seemingly incongruent words together. How did you arrive at the title?
Sure. So, yeah, I think this title came to me in a lot of different ways. So I'm glad that you caught on to my kind of my formula for titles. It's always two words, and they, are kind of, like you said, like paradoxical in some ways. Like they're incongruent. They don't quite belong. Something being ugly and musical, but then something being a good but monstrous. And I liked that kind of like formula. So I'm hoping a third book will follow the same. But Good Monster, the title itself, that phrase itself comes from one of the poems. It's diary entry number 34, Epigenetics. And in this poem, I'm, talking about kind of the inheritance of trauma and the ancestors, and then also my own trauma, earlyhood trauma with someone in my family. And the line says, "Did he make me a good monster or a bad one?" And, I've thought about that. What does trauma make of us? Does it make us monstrous? And can it be that we are good monsters, or bad ones? And what does that mean? And I really wanted to kind of understand that, not necessarily just, within this poem, but for myself in my own life. I think I've carried this feeling that I am quite monstrous, that because of my trauma, certain kind of patterns seem to repeat themselves, ones that are damaging to myself and potentially those around me. And I've felt so monstrous at times because of it. And in a way, did that make me bad because I'm repeating these monstrous kind of behaviors? Or is that good in the sense that that's what he wanted me to become all along? I don't know. There's so many different ways of thinking. But another reason why the word monster itself is so important to me is because I do this particular type of therapy called internal family systems therapy, or IFS. And within IFS, you name the parts of yourself that are burdened or holding on to trauma. And a lot of the times, those parts of yourselves, act together. I call them, they're neighbors of sorts. But there's a certain pattern. And for me, it's my anxiety and depression and my boundless need, as I like to call it. And collectively, they are my monster. And so it's been, I've been doing this type of therapy for about 12 years. So I've been talking about this monster for quite some time. And one of the reasons why this title felt so important was because I wanted to give the monster a place to live, a safe place to live. And, I had been villainizing this monstrous part, or this monstrous little like trifecta of parts for so long. And instead, I wanted to give her the space that she needed to say whatever it was that she needed to say. And lo and behold, a book is born.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all that, because I feel like it gave
Yeah.
me a whole new look at the book, having read it. Do you
Yeah,
watch any
absolutely.
TV?
Oh yeah, I watch so much TV.
Have you seen Undone?
No, I haven't. I haven't seen
You need
Undone.
to. I feel like you would really appreciate it.
I'm gonna
Because
write
it's
that
all
down.
about like trauma. I don't think it's like the same kind of trauma, but it's somewhat similar in the sense that it's like generational. And
Okay.
it's such an interesting take on it, especially the second season is very intense, and it just
Mm,
like it travels through like the family line and stuff, and it's really
mm.
interesting.
Well, I'm here for the intensity.
Okay, tell me more about the epigraph.
The epigraph, well, it comes from one of my favorite Dorothy Alasky poems, which is called Ars Poetica. And the epigraph is like when he said, I am no good. I am no good. Goodness is not the point anymore. Holding on to things. Now that's the point. And kind of thinking back to what I was saying earlier about things being good versus bad, I almost felt like, you know, Dottie answers the question for us. Like, goodness really isn't the point, is it? It's about holding on to things. And I think that's also what poetry is about. Forget good poem, bad poem. Like, what is poetry? It's about holding on to everything. It's about the container in which all of these things can live. And, whether my monster is good or bad, that's not the point either. It's it's kind of like more so like how I take care of her, how I like metaphorically hold on to her. So that's kind of where the inspiration to use that epigraph came from.
How does your relationship to reverence or irreverence impact your work?
Mm. Well, I think they're related. I like to revere the irreverent, I guess. Um, I especially just like the mundane things of the world, like, you know, McDonald's McChicken wrappers, cans of ginger ale, um, just anything. That's that's the stuff of life, isn't it? Like, at least my life, there's a lot of that. But we all have these really mundane, you know, activities or things that we see, day in and day out, washing dishes and, even just showering. Um, all of those things are so important because like we take a lot of time doing all of those things. And that to me is kind of like where I do my best thinking is within the mundane. And I find that mundane things connect me to bigger picture things, specifically trauma, with someone that has, CPTSD, I can see, or I can witness something randomly that feels, you know, not connected in any way to something that I've experienced, but somehow my mind decides to latch onto it and say, "Oh, that reminds me of blank." It's just an association game, and for me, I find a lot of power in associating mundane things with things that feel much heavier, and it almost feels easier to do that. It feels more like play as opposed to um feeling really really heavy. And because writing about trauma that's difficult and that's the majority of what I write about. So I've had to find a way in which to, come at it from a different perspective. And the mundane, the irreverent, or revering the irreverent is a way in which I find works for me.
Throughout the book, you often equate things to death or dying. Can you talk a bit about that?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. That should tell you the type of person I am, that you say something about death and dying and I start laughing. Yes, I often do equate things to death and dying because I think that for my parts, my internal family that I mentioned before, everything feels so dire. It feels like, oh, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And sometimes it is. Let's be real. And it feels like a death. It feels like something that's, not that I will not survive from, but somehow I end up surviving it over and over and over again. And it's just interesting to me how, honestly, like how I've survived. I've experienced so much pain, yet here I am having this conversation with you. And I almost don't know how that happened. How did those 35 years just, they're gone, but at the same time they aren't. Like I did live those. Those felt like some very long years, but at the same time it went by very, very quickly. But there was a lot of pain, and in some cases, death didn't happen, but near death did almost. It was very close to near death, several times. So it's a place, it's an emotion that I don't really know how to equate it to anything in any language other than it feels like dying. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Good. I'm glad. I'm glad it makes sense to somebody.
One thing I loved was when a poem tells you what it's doing, specifically the lines, the part of the poem that's about me is this. And then another line was, I tried to make a metaphor of this. So can you talk a bit about that impulse? How often do you consider, or how often do you write with the reader in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, I don't know. I think I am interested in just removing the mask of like, I am the poet, the speaker, this and that. It's like, no, I am writing this poem, and like you're watching me, you're witnessing me as you're reading me creating this poem. So instead of pretending that it's not a poem, or that I'm not the kind of the engineer of it all, I take that on instead. Like I'm trying to make a metaphor out of this. Here, witness me do it poorly, or witness me succeed. And the one line where I say the part of this poem that's about me is this. I mean, that relates to the title where I say another poem about an ex, but really it's about me. Because the majority of that poem, I am talking about an ex. But at the end of the day, the entire poem is about me, which is what I end up saying because of the way I view the ex, the way that I loved that person and continue to love. I think the last line of that poem is, I find something to love like I find air in a room. I just walk in. And that's very much me. But I like to kind of like remove the mask and tell the reader what it is that I'm doing. And to me, it feels less pretentious. I like to show the seams of the creation, instead of trying to hide them. I'm not a seamstress, you know. I can barely sew.
Do you have a favorite poem in the collection?
Ooh, a favorite poem. I think one of my favorite poems to read is I'm Almost 30. That one's a lot of fun because I repeat, I'm almost 30 throughout the poem. I mentioned the Backstreet Boys and, waiting in line to pee at a Backstreet Boys concert. I talk about death. I talk, I even talk about my serving job in that poem. So it encompasses a lot of different things, and the speaker or me, I'm in a lot of different scenes as well. And I like the ride that it takes the reader or the listener on. It's wild and it's funny. It is gut-wrenching at times. And then sometimes there are softer moments. And that's what I love about poems is, when it makes me feel every emotion in, however many lines, let's say for a sonnet in 14 lines, that to me is magic, so.
You mentioned performing, and I've actually seen you perform a couple times, and I've always
Yeah.
really enjoyed it. You're always one of my favorite people to watch perform. Do you enjoy performing or?
Oh yeah. I mean, I love it. It's so fun to like feed off of the energy that's in the room or the energy of, let's say, the previous reader or um and I love the affirmation of snaps and claps. Like I need that, or like the oohs and the ahs. I was like, I need that in order to be a good reader or performer. I find it really difficult to read to a room that is completely silent throughout the entire experience. That feels like death. Because I want people to react in real time to, what I'm reading. And I want it to be a kind of collaborative experience as opposed to people are just, watching me do something as opposed to being a part of the performance, as it were. And I like, the interaction of that. And it's also, a way for me to exercise my voice, my instrument. I when I grew up in church, I was a singer. I was a leader of the girls singing group, and I was just always singing, always using my voice. And I don't sing anymore except like for in the shower or, the um, karaoke sporadically whenever that happens. But reading is my chance to sing, but in a way that's just a different melody. It's not to music. So I really enjoy that. Um, yeah, I do.
I love the Spotify playlist at the end of the collection, and I love
Thank
that it
you.
introduced me to all of the other Spotify playlists that Copper Canyon puts out.
Yes,
And
yes.
I wanted to ask, do you really write to music, or did you compile that after the fact?
Mm. Yeah, so I also did a playlist to ugly music as well. Granted, I didn't, you know, think of like including a QR code in the back, like I did for this book. That was all me. I was like, let's put a QR code in the back. So, and I just felt like, um, I really wanted to, same like what I did with Ugly Music, is have a song for each poem in the collection, which was not something that Copper Canyon asked me to do. They just had like, oh, you can make a playlist of like 10, 15 songs, whatever you want, of things that kind of reflect the mood or things that, songs that you may have listened to while writing. And I was like, cool. No, I'm going to do one for every poem. Which is what I did for Ugly Music. And I just like, I'm here for the challenge. And, yeah, because I imagine that the songs inform the reading, or the reading informs the songs in some type of way. And, I want to take readers on a journey, and sometimes I need music in order to do that, especially if I mention a song in the poem, um, or mention something that we're all familiar with the soundtrack of it. For instance, in one of my sad girl sonnets, I talk about Sex in the City. The minute I say that, we all hear the soundtrack in our head. You know what I mean? That theme song, like we know that. So that's on the playlist. So I really wanted to bring the sounds of the poems, whatever they were, if they were music, to the reader. So the playlist was a great way to accomplish that. And to answer your question about, do I write to music? Sometimes, um, sometimes my poems are inspired by certain songs, especially in my first collection, Ugly Music. Um, and other times I can't listen to music at all while I'm writing because I need to hear my own music. I need to hear the language, and music can sometimes interfere with that. But I do like the idea of the playlist kind of like living within the book as something to accompany it. So I'm glad we were able to put that nifty QR code in there. The technology we have.
Yeah, no, I did worry about the longevity of it though.
Mm, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but aside from that, I think it's really cool. And
yeah,
I guess if you have like the address for the site and like you mentioned Spotify, so even if
yeah,
the
yeah.
QR code stopped working for whatever reason, I still think it could work.
Right. Yeah, because I think I just put like a short URL in there as well, just in case. But everything's linked on my website as well. So if you don't even know how to use a QR code, then you can find this playlist. Don't you worry.
You talk a bit about language and your own music as you're writing. What is your relationship to form? Do you have a favorite?
The sonnet is my favorite. But it's my own take on the sonnet, which I don't really care um, for meter. Or at least I don't stick to a strict meter. I should say that. I like the music that meter can create, though I like it to feel organic. But in some ways, like I was talking to my students about this, my MFA students, um, and it's like, what does your particular rhythm sound like? What does my particular rhythm sound like of a line? Like, um, and getting used to that being my own meter, as opposed to feeling like I need to stick to, like iambic pentameter, for instance. So I'm really interested in that, and each poet's individual meter or music. I also don't really worry about rhyme scheme either. So what makes these sonnets is that they're 14 lines and they have a volta or even voltas for that matter. Because to me, the volta is the most important part of the sonnet, is that turn, that shift, like when the poet takes us somewhere so unexpected. Um, and yeah, like that's kind of like the ride I want to take the reader on. And um, I have the words La Volta tattooed on my wrist, because the sad girl sonnets that are in Good Monster, I wrote them while I was in Florence, Italy. And I was going through a lot of kind of like emotional turmoil, at that time. And I just remember thinking, like, this is just within my life, this is just another volta. This is just another shift. And things will continue to turn and turn and turn, in my life. Um, and I just have to kind of be here for them, and survive them. So that tattoo is just a reminder of my resiliency to continue to, survive throughout all of the voltas that life throws my way.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
What was your organizing principle for the collection?
Yeah, this one was a little bit more difficult than my first book. I felt like there wasn't as clear of a narrative as there was for the first one. So I needed to kind of create one. And it was hard because within specific poems, I felt like, okay, these are connected, but should they be next to each other? Should they be, at different points within the collection? I was trying to really figure out like how that was all gonna work out. And my friend, and now pressmate, or two-time pressmate, Caleb Ray Kendrilli, has this really amazing way of organizing, or beginning to organize a manuscript. And they have this color-coded system where they, first what they do is they put the entire manuscript in a word cloud generator. You can just pop an entire file in a word cloud generator, and you can see like what words or themes continue to pop up. And with that, with maybe like, let's say like 6 of them, you assign them colors, and you're like, okay, well, one of the words I used a lot was father. Well, okay, poems that have to do with my father, I'll assign the color green or something like that. And kind of going throughout the manuscript and coloring at the top of the page the color green, or whatever color you assign to a particular theme. And then laying them all out on the floor and seeing like, what kind of what patterns are being shown just within the colors themselves. Like, is there too much green in this area and not enough red? Or is that intentional? Do I want to add, let's say, more poems that have blue, whatever? But that was a great way to actually visually see what I was doing and the narrative I was creating. So it was really important for me to add a little bit of variety within each of the sections of the book. And I wanted the sad girl sonnets within the book to be in order that they were written, and I wanted them to feel like little episodes within the book itself, as opposed to being scattered within the other larger sections. So it was just a lot of things happening at once, and Caleb's color coding system was really helpful and in managing. And yeah, it's wonderful. I highly recommend it to anyone who's trying to organize a manuscript.
That sounds fascinating.
Yes. Yeah.
You write all diary entry poems or collages written with lines collected from 36 and counting personal journals kept since age 9. Can you talk a bit about that process?
Sure. So this project started when I was an MFA student at NYU. And my professor, Matthew Rohrer, had a class about making it new. And we were looking at the centos form, centos, everyone pronounces it different, which is a poem using borrowed lines from other writers. And we were supposed to write a centos poem. And I felt really weird about borrowing other people's words, even if I was going to credit them. So I looked at my bookshelf and I said, well, I have a ton of my own journals. Why don't I just use my own words? So I did. And the diary entry series was born because I was afraid to use other people's words. And it was just a lot of fun, like delving back into these old diaries that I started writing in since I was 9, and just being reacquainted with myself. And, being however old I was, looking at the journal and like meeting myself at 9 years old as a 30-year-old, or meeting myself at 11 years old as a 35-year-old, or, it was just, it felt different every single time. And it feels different every single time I open one of these diaries. But one thing about these collage poems is that I have assigned myself rules or constraints. And some of them that I'll share with you is that verb tenses can be changed depending on, the language that I end up collecting from the journal. Pronouns can be changed. God, Jesus, Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit are interchangeable. And I'm trying to think of another thing. Oh, and any filler language, any conjunctions, prepositions, things along those lines, just connective tissue, I can just pull from wherever I need it. And with this collected language that I've taken from, let's say, one journal. So I mentioned diary entry number 34 earlier. So I would have taken the 34th journal, collected lines from it, and written a collage poem using those lines and applying these constraints of my own. And then sometimes there are constraints upon constraints when, let's say, a diary entry poem is also a pantoum or a sestina or even a sonnet, So I just have a lot of fun with it, especially considering the fact that I'm delving into some really serious, heavy trauma when I'm going back into these journals. And a way for me to just be even like 1 degree removed from it is to play with the language. And it just allows me enough distance that I don't get sucked into the trauma. Instead, I am kind of like excavating and, building something, back together, sometimes in a different way. And it's really a lot of fun. And like the strange juxtapositions that you can create. That's my favorite thing, is just seeing like, how weird can I make this poem? That's my favorite part.
I feel like this conversation has already given me so many prompts, but
Good.
can you give our viewers a prompt based on Good Monster?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the prompt, is to look at maybe something that you've written in the past, or maybe a collection of things that you've written in the past. And even if you don't keep, journals, maybe you have a stack of old, English papers that you wrote from, a few semesters ago, anything like that. And collect lines from it and see if you can create a poem that tells a different story than the one from the original text. And just to play with the language, and see what happens. And if you end up somewhere weird and you don't like that, well, then arrange them in a different way and see what story you can tell. That's always fun. One thing I do that I don't believe it was in Good Monster, but in the book Ugly Music, I have what's called sister poems, and I have a diary entry that's the same number. So diary entry number 16. There's both diary entry number 16, dysmorphia, and then diary entry number 16, about using my body. And they're sister poems because they use the exact same language to write a different poem. And that's always fun to see how these images or themes or words can be transformed just by placing them somewhere different in the poem. So, yeah, that is my writing prompt. Just have fun.
What do you most hope people take away from this book?
I think what I hope people take away from this book is a feeling of not being alone, that somewhere in the universe there is someone named Diannely Antigua writing sad poems, and that sadness sees the reader's sadness, and they can be in each other's company, as opposed to living in one's own sadness and solitude. I hope that people can commune with the book in that type of way, as if they were having a conversation with me in the room. And I love when, someone at a reading comes up to me and says, that one poem really resonated with me because, I'm a survivor of this and that. And then they'll tell me, I've never shared that with anyone before. And that to me is, one of the biggest reasons why I continue to write these poems, is because people need them. Not necessarily just my poems, but people need to read poems about difficult things, because we're all survivors of something. And we need to feel that we aren't alone in that, because if anything, that feeling of isolation is what does some of the most damage to us, is feeling as though there's no one else there with us. So I hope that this book provides a kind of little sad community for my readers.
I love that. I might also use that as a soundbite.
Yeah, do that.
So that's it for my questions, but was there anything I didn't ask that you really wanted to talk about?
No, I thought you asked like really good questions. I always love like when people avoid the question like, oh, so when did you start writing? It's like, well, like we can hear about that, but like let's talk about like the things I'm doing now, and like I loved that you really just asked some thought-provoking questions. So that's so important. So I'm really appreciative of that. And yeah, thank you for asking me to do this, and also for just reading my little book. So that means a lot to me.
Absolutely. No, you're definitely one of my favorite poets. So, of course, thank you for
Oh,
agreeing to
wow.
do this.
Yeah, I mean, this is awesome. I was excited about it for sure. Yeah, like you're such a kind soul, and anytime that we've interacted, I've just felt that light and that kindness. So I was like, absolutely.
That's so
thank you
nice.
for the opportunity.
All right, Diannely, it was so great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was so lovely.